Great. So why don't we get started? I'm really delighted to welcome everyone back to the MIT Wednesday seminar series for the spring semester of 2021, coming to you live on YouTube as well as over Zoom. A little bit of a late start this spring because MIT delayed the start of our spring semester as well for reasons to accommodate folks with the pandemic and our teaching schedules and everything else. So, but we've got a great program for this semester. All of the speakers are listed on our website. I encourage you to check out what we will be offering. It's really a great group. And starting with an absolutely terrific talk today by Markus Garlauskas, and he'll be discussing strategic assessment of a hard target, North Korea. And I really can't think of someone who's more equipped to do this. Markus is a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Securities Asia Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He also served in the U.S. government for almost 20 years. He was appointed as the Senior National Intelligence, he was appointed to the Senior National Intelligence Service as the NIO from North Korea on the NIC from July of 2014 to June of 2020. So really a front row seat to everything that was going on the peninsula. As NIO, he led the U.S. intelligence community strategic analysis on North Korean issues and expanded analytic outreach to non-government experts as well. He provided direct analytic support to top-level policy deliberations, including the presidential transition, as well as the summits in Singapore and Hanoi with North Korea. Previously, he also served for 12 years overseas at the headquarters of the UN Command, Combined Forces Command, and U.S. Forces Korea in Seoul. His staff assignments there included Chief of the Intelligence Estimates Branch, as well as Director of the Strategy Division. For his service in Korea, Markus received the Joint Civilian Distinguished Service Award, the highest civilian award from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in History from Kent State. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown in their Security Studies program, teaching a course of his own design this semester entitled Strategic Assessment on North Korea. So Markus, we're really delighted to have you with us today and delighted to have you kick off our series for the spring semester. And let me now turn the screen over to you. Thanks.
Andrew, thank you. Taylor, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Andrew, too, for setting up the technical aspects of this. And then Vipin, of course, for providing the initial idea for me to be able to come. Welcome all of you to my study. I don't have the fire going because it's actually relatively warm here in McLean now. As Taylor just mentioned, we're going to be talking today about the idea of strategic analysis of a hard target using North Korea as the example, because I know North Korea is of great interest these days about what's going to happen next with this regime in North Korea that is often described as unpredictable. And as I'll talk about, it's not nearly as unpredictable as it may appear. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really based on my own experience as the chief of strategy for the three commands, and also from my time as national intelligence officer. But I want to emphasize what I'm going to talk about. You're not going to see in any document. It's not in an official position, and it doesn't imply any endorsement by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the IC, or the U.S. government. My views are my own, and I think they're in some ways fairly distinct, as I'll talk about. So first of all, I think it's quite important for people, whether they're students in a security studies program or strategic analysts supporting high-level decision makers or the high-level decision makers themselves, to make a distinction about what strategic analysis is and what it isn't, and make use of strategic analysis to support key decisions. And so the first element of the definition of what I'm going to talk about with strategic analysis is that this is the level that I prefer to operate at because I think it's the most impactful level for decision making, and it's the most appropriate to put an issue in a larger context for a broad audience and for the highest level of decision makers, people who have global portfolios, global interests, and aren't just focused on one particular country or one particular issue set. And so in the case of North Korea, I also think it's where we should really focus on North Korea in terms of forecasting its behavior and thinking about those decisions. I think a lot of our challenges with North Korea is we have a tendency to focus on the tactical rather than the strategic. And as a result, I think we're missing some of the flaws in the strategy on the strategic level assumptions we've had about North Korea. Now, I think first you'll notice when I talk about strategic analysis, I don't use the term strategic intelligence analysis, even though I spent most of my time in the intelligence community in my career in government. I do think there's a lot to be learned from intelligence methodology, and certainly it gives us some really great frameworks and some great background and some information for doing analysis for supporting decision making. But the reason why I really urge people to think beyond the methodologies used by intelligence is because intelligence can be very adversary oriented. And when you're talking about strategy, I think you have to fully consider the friendly element, the element of our actions, our policies in the case of the United States, to come up with the best possible strategic analysis to go beyond the Intel frameworks. And that's one of the reasons why I developed the course that Taylor mentioned. Also, I think it's important to consider how you have to pick your battles in some ways with strategic analysis, that you have to prioritize and really narrow to what's really truly strategic, because it's very easy to have your efforts as an analyst or as a policymaker diffused among a whole range of different things and not really focus on what's strategic. So what do I mean when I use the word strategic? Because this is an overused word these days. Everything seems to be strategic, especially a lot of offices, in the Pentagon, different military organizations, strategic plans, strategic this, strategic that. And I think there's a lot of confusion about the term, which has sort of muddied the waters. And strategic means that it's a issue that's going to be a big decision or a big consideration with long-term major national security implications in the case of national security strategy. It isn't the level of the decision maker when I say strategic. So I provided support to as you heard, so to the president, to very senior level decision makers, but not everything I necessarily did in that space was truly strategic. And so, for example, when you're thinking about supporting a top level decision maker, not every decision that they make, every consideration they have is truly strategic. When the president is deciding what talking point he's going to use at a meeting, is this important? Yes. Is he a high level decision maker? Yes. But this is typically not a strategic decision. The overall approach that he's going to take to a country in which that talking point might fit, okay, that's a strategic decision. Also, it's really important that strategic analysis be considered in terms of a very broad and interdisciplinary and regional context. You cannot do strategic analysis of just one aspect of an issue or just one country in isolation, or you can't do, there was this, I think in the past, this tendency to consider military strategy or theater strategy. And these are ideas that I think are important to have some focus, but you can't consider the military in isolation. You can't consider just a single theater of conflict in isolation. And those terms can sometimes be, I think, confining to your thinking. So by definition, strategic analysis has to be broad. It has to be disciplinary, interdisciplinary. But one of the other things that also trips people up is this idea of a long time frame for strategic analysis. And so it gets portrayed as this cumbersome, long process that takes months to complete, that involves, pages and pages of analysis, these books, essentially, that you're expecting decision makers to read. And as a result, strategic analysis ends up becoming kind of irrelevant when it's couched in those terms. Now, sometimes I'll tell you, it does take a long time to do strategic analysis, particularly if you're plowing new ground, but long-term analysis isn't necessarily strategic. And the time horizon really for strategic is not when the products are being done or when the decision is being made, it's how long the effects last. And so oftentimes, as the result of the way the policy process works and the political, election cycles in the United States work, you have to make strategic level decisions potentially in a relatively short period of time, even if they're going to have lasting effects. And so one of these times we're living through right now, in a transition between administrations, you don't have months and months or years to make decisions that are going to potentially ripple through months, years, and decades ahead. You have to make those decisions in a timely manner. Otherwise, you're going to miss these strategic windows of opportunity. And sometimes not making a decision is essentially a decision that has its own effects. So the time factor for the strategic analysis, this sort of analysis that I like to focus on, that we're talking about today, is focused on the future, right? It has to look beyond what has happened, what is going on now, and it has to look far into the future. What are the implications of the decisions? What are the key factors at play? But that doesn't mean it's a predictive science. As a matter of fact, the best strategic analysis is actually going to be useful to the decision maker, but if considered purely in isolation as just what was written down, it will actually probably be wrong in comparison to what happens later. And the paradox of this is the point of strategic analysis is not to be right, it's to inform better strategic decisions that will then change the circumstances being assessed. So it creates this paradox where the best analysis warns of threats that turn out not to materialize because they provide that information to decision makers so they avoid the threat materializing. And so basically the worst case scenarios that may be portrayed in strategic analysis never end up coming to pass, not because they're not realistic, not because they're not possible, but because they inform decision making then to avoid that worst case scenario. And so if strategic analysis anticipates the probability of a devastating war, for example, and it's a well-organized analysis, it's persuasive, it's credible, it's impactful, then of course the war will be avoided and it'll look like the people who provided that analysis were exaggerating or they were wrong. And so that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to evaluate strategic analysis and put it into context. Another term that we really need to talk about is this idea of a hard target. North Korea is always portrayed in these terms, or typically portrayed in these terms of being a hard target, right? And the reason why this term is often used is that the intelligence community likes to use this to characterize the particularly hard intelligence collection problems, right? North Korea is a great example because it's a closed society, has limited foreign interaction, limited visitors, limited diplomatic relationships, just doesn't have much contact with the outside world. You can't go into North Korea and roam around and look at things on the ground and see for yourself in the way you can in a lot of other countries. And North Korea itself, as a society, as a regime, can be very paranoid, very opaque, lots of denial and deception, propaganda, hard to sort truth from fiction, and these sorts of things. And so there is some validity to the idea that it is a hard target in the broadest sense. But just because it's a hard target doesn't mean it's a black hole where you can't get useful information, particularly for the strategic level. And so there's this mistaken idea that we're clueless or we're stymied when it comes to North Korea and that we can't possibly know anything. And sure, there's limitations in what we're going to know, but if you apply good, rigorous logic and tradecraft at the strategic analysis level, you can get useful understanding at the strategic level of North Korea's capabilities and tensions that will inform good strategic decisions. And I think this is true of other hard targets as well. There's a tendency to focus on the collection problem as opposed to focus on the analytic aspect of what you can do with the collection you can get, particularly at the strategic level. And it's important to prioritize because there's a limited amount of time. There's, in the case of intelligence, there's a limited amount of collection capacity. So you got to focus your resources and your time when you're doing this sort of work at the strategic level on the things that are going to matter. And so you have to understand what the right questions are to attack and not get focused on just trying to analyze an issue because you have data on it or because it's interesting or even because a policymaker asks about it. Not everything a high-level policymaker asks about is really truly strategic in its significance. And so when it comes to hard targets, though, in the broadest sense, you can think of the future as a hard target because no matter how much understanding we have of what's happened before or what's going on now, there's no magical source of information collection that will be able to tell us what's going to happen next year or the year after. The future is too complex. There's too many variables. You have to rely on analytic techniques and make judgments that are based on probability and possibility rather than be able to have a level of certainty that you can have if you're going after something that's in the past. So by definition, even if you have unlimited data about something, looking at strategic analysis, you're always going to be operating in the realm of uncertainty. I mean, think about weather forecasters, for example. The weather is the very opposite of a traditional IC definition of a hard target, right? The collection problem is essentially solved. The data available on weather is enormous. It's widely shared. You can get data on temperature, wind, barometric pressure from all sorts of different locations. You can get it through satellites, through aircraft, through ground observation. I mean, you have a tremendous amount of data to work with if you're analyzing weather patterns and trying to forecast the weather. But yeah, even though you have decades of history, you have tremendous amounts of data, you have all these models and all these theories and everything else. In the end, the weather is still essentially impossible to predict with high accuracy. What you can do is you can forecast, you can warn of possibilities. And in the end, that's really what you can do in strategic analysis terms with the data you have available, no matter how good or bad. So I think the focus on North Korea as a hard target is distracting from the fact that strategic analysis, by definition, is always going to be dealing with, in some sense, a hard target. And so just quickly, because I know we want to get into the North Korea part, just to wrap up this discussion on methodology, when it comes to looking to the future, there's a whole range of methodological approaches, and I'm not going to go into them in great deal, but I'm really going to talk about three that have affected my thinking that are perhaps the most prominent in some ways on national security issues. The first approach is estimative intelligence analysis, and this comes from the U.S. intelligence community, and it was really promulgated, in many ways developed by a person by a former professor actually named Sherman, who was really the founder of this methodology in the aftermath of World War II, and helped actually build the organization that grew into the National Intelligence Council, where I worked as NIO. And his thinking emerges primarily actually from writings that he did for the CIA and is published through the Center for Intelligence Study of Intelligence. And they have his unclassified writing and his declassified writing available on its website. So this is a very well developed set of methodological ideas that actually goes back more than a half century. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Next, to consider is the net assessment approach, which was developed by, among others, the proponent of it, Andrew Marshall, as he organized the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. And then the third approach is referred to as super forecasting, and this is a much more recent approach developed by Phil Tetlock and employed through his Good Judgment project. And he actually explains super forecasting in the best-selling book of the same title. So all three of these ideas are in the public space. They're fairly well known. They're fairly respected. But the thing to keep in mind is none of the three of these actually, I think, are the solution alone for strategic analysis, but you can take elements from each of them. So starting with Sherman Kent's approach, I mean, he begins his thinking on estimative intelligence and his writing on it with humility. And he famously said, estimating is what we do when we do not know. But his concept was based on building a credible foundation of knowledge to assess and examine what we can really know and ground it in certainty, and then over layers, basically building like a pyramid of greater levels of uncertainty where you're making assessments, you're making judgments, you're making assumptions, which builds you to the point of the pyramid where you get to the point where you're having that so what for the policymaker, where you're informing the strategic level decisions. And through that, you're trying to minimize the amount of bias as you add those layers, but you understand that there's uncertainty, you're having to make judgments as you go forward. And as a historian, Kent, I think, approach this in the sense of you have to build a narrative, right? It's not enough to be right. You have to explain it in a way that makes sense. And you have to build a logical narrative that's going to be credible. Otherwise, are you really going to be able to inform decision-making? So, but this approach is very much focused on the adversary. Andrew Marshall's approach of net assessment emerged from thinking about the Cold War. And it's a method of analysis is characterized by focusing on two or more competitors or opponents through a comparative process. It's about the interactions and the comparisons between the developing capabilities and intentions of, like I said, two or more adversaries. Much like estimative intelligence, though, it's a bit more art than science, right? But one of the huge advantages that it has over estimative approaches is that it explicitly considers the interaction between the friendly and the adversary. And Kent's approach, because he was an intelligence officer, he didn't want to be seen as trying to dictate or pass judgment on policy, whereas Andrew Marshall's net assessment approach explicitly thinks about, all right, so what are we doing and how does it affect the adversary and how does the adversary affect what we're doing? So it's much more about that interaction. And so I think that's a huge advantage that it adds. And I think combining the two approaches is a very helpful way to think about things. Even if, like I said, this is not necessarily something that's used in the intelligence community because of this concern about not wanting to look at the friendly side of the equation. And then in contrast to these two, Phil Tetlock's super forecasting approach is much more a mathematical probabilistic approach, and it focuses very much on specifics. It tries to take the art of looking at the future and make it much more scientific. And so without going into the great depth of how this is done, basically the idea is you focus on training a particular type of mind, a super forecaster, who actually needs not be and is typically not an actual deep expert on the topic being forecasted, right? And so whereas Kent wants to focus on the foundation and Andy Marshall is focusing on the interactions between adversaries, Tatlock is focused on how do you eliminate bias and how do you break down the analytic questions about the future into these very discrete and time-limited yes or no questions that are as specific as possible, but still ideally relevant to decision makers. And so this gets to very specific questions like, will North Korea launch X type of missile before a certain date? And so this is something then that if you're correct, of course, you can say, hey, I anticipated it correctly. And if you're incorrect, you can look back and say, hey, where did I get this wrong? And so over time, the idea is that it actually trains the individual or the organization to do better forecasting. The problem that I have with Tetlock is a lot of times these questions get broken down in such a way that they're not really that useful for decision makers in the end. And also, they don't necessarily take into account the fact that you have to explain the why, and you have to construct a logical narrative, as Kent was saying, to explain this decision to decision makers in a way that's going to be compelling and have an impact. But and also it doesn't explain how you can change things, how you can change the dynamics. Just being able to predict whether or not a particular thing is going to happen, even if it's a higher level of probability, it makes the decision maker reactive rather than proactive potentially. Whereas net assessment really looks at that interaction with the adversary and with allies. So in my own work, I borrow from all three of these approaches. And so I'm going to describe a bit of my own estimate and forecast for North Korea in 2021. So this is when we get into the North Korea stuff. I think a good place to start is you have to do what Kent did, and you got to build the foundation and look a bit at the history. And I'm not going to go back to the days of Kim Il-sung and the foundation of North Korea, but let's just go back a few years here into 2016. 2016 and 2017 saw an unprecedented level of North Korean strategic weapons testing. We had 3 nuclear tests, dozens of ballistic missile launches, and we had 3 North Korean ICBMs test launched in 2017. That was a few years ago, but it's important to keep in mind how important that progress that the North Koreans made in 2016 and 2017 was, increasing ranges of missiles and then also increasing yield of these underground nuclear tests. And so this really advanced the credibility and capability of strategic weapons, and particularly advanced the goal that that over and over again we've seen from North Korea to have this credible ability to threaten the homeland of the United States, to be able to say they have deterrence and leverage over the U.S., to be able to go after not just targets in the immediate vicinity of North Korea, but to reach the U.S. And this whole phenomenon I'm describing has been very well laid out in annual intelligence community reports, including this fixation that North Korea has had in unclassified reports to Congress, that this fixation that North Korea has had on achieving this goal of being able to reliably strike the U.S. With nuclear weapons. So then what happens next? Kim pauses his testing to pivot to diplomacy. So in 2018, we have the Olympics, we have a whole variety of summitry, we have the Singapore summit itself, which was alluded to earlier. And then there's this change in mood, right? The North Koreans haven't fired a ballistic missile for almost a year, and the planning for the next summit, is underway by the end of the year. But ultimately, the slow pivot to confrontation begins back when there's a clear, or I should say, begins when there is a clear lack of agreement in the aftermath of Singapore, and it's accelerating when Kim Jong-un finds he can't get the deal that he wanted out of the United States, out of President Trump at the Hanoi summit in February 2019. And so not long after that, then you start seeing the other elements of North Korea's return to a more confrontational stance fall into place. Kim sets a year-end deadline for a change in the U.S. position, and as the deadline approaches, North Korea announces static missile engine testing. There's these cryptic comments about a Christmas gift, but ultimately there's no new launches when the deadline expired, right? But with the start of 2020, Kim Jong-un sends strong signals that he's going to be emphasizing development, testing, production, and deployment of strategic weapons, and he makes these public statements and lays out personnel choices. And then during this time, he's testing shorter range systems that still have strategic level capability, arguably, but they're just not the systems that can reach the United States. They can, some of these are nuclear capable systems, apparently. Some of these are actually, all of these are solid fuel based systems, which are more flexible, more reliable in terms of, or I should say survivable, than the liquid fueled systems that North Korea had been focusing on. So they're developing their capabilities in a whole new direction. And these launches start not long after the Hanoi summit, and then of course they continue into 2020. But just Kim stays short of an ICBM test. He keeps developing these capabilities, and what he finds, again, this friendly adversary interaction, he finds even though he's testing ballistic missiles, which are a violation of UN Security Council resolutions that contradict the prohibitions on North Korea continuing its ballistic missile program, he finds that the U.S. is not pushing back, really, that the U.S. is downplaying it, that the U.S. will still hold these diplomatic meetings with North Korea. Despite the testing, North Korea is essentially getting a pass on testing these ballistic missiles. Just because it hasn't tested ICBMs and nukes doesn't mean it's not advancing the program through construction and through testing. And so by October of last year, then you see these displays of really truly major advances that they're trying to demonstrate in the weapons program, including behind me there, that monster missile, the biggest ICBM that North Korea has ever displayed. Now, there's a question whether or not these things are fully ready for testing and what their true capabilities are going to be. But the whole range of things that Kim shows at the military parade last October really shows the advancement in the program, the advancement in progress they've made, even if you can debate about some of the specifics. And we can talk more about some of those things in question. And so what it leads into then is this year, at the beginning of the year, Kim Jong-un holds his party Congress. And normally these happen every 5 years. But this one, I think, is really important to pay attention to because it was timed and set up prior to the U.S. presidential inauguration, right? He's not waiting, Kim Jong-un, to see what the reaction is going to be from the United States and what the reaction of the new administration is. He's a leader of North Korea. It was actually not the last party Congress, I should say, wasn't even held until May in the previous 5 years. So if Kim wanted to meet the 5-year mark, he had plenty of flexibility to do it long after the inauguration, but he chose not to, right? He wanted to be the first mover, in my view, to lay out the direction and the position of North Korea in the face of the United States, to force the United States to react to him rather than being in a position to react to the United States. And so this goes back to the whole net assessment methodology. As you can see, the interaction between the North Koreans and the United States in terms of their thinking about what their behavior is going to be and their message is going to potentially influence the U.S. or they're going to have to shape it for the U.S. And so there's no sign of change of direction. If anything, it's a further hardening of North Korea's position. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that as part of this party Congress, Kim Jong-un is not just announcing and committing to a whole range of new weapons, but he's bracing the country to face additional economic hardship. He's not preparing for opportunities should there be an easing of sanctions, should there be some break in relations. He's doing quite the opposite. He's positioning the country to hunker down and be prepared to endure pain, endure hardship, and to rely minimally on external trade. And that, to me, is a really telling sign that Kim Jong-un plans to be on a path of confrontation, not on a path of reconciliation in the years ahead. And then you layer on top of that the announcements he made about all these wide range of weapon systems. And again, we can talk about some of the specifics in Q&A, but he's talking about things that include tactical nuclear weapons. He's talking about multiple warhead missiles. He's talking about solid fuel intercontinental missiles that can reach the U.S. He's also talking about increasing the accuracy of the missiles that can reach the U.S. And these are things he's talking about is fairly near-term things. And then he talks more generally and theoretically about things like hypersonic weapons and these sorts of things that show that North Korea is not just going to, in Kim's explanation, just stop at a certain level of capability. It's going to keep advancing. And so again, that interaction between the U.S. and North Korea is the North Koreans. They already are trying to get out ahead of the defensive capabilities of the U.S. and South Korea. They're already showing that, and so it puts us in a position where North Korea is not static, right? We can't rest on our laurels in thinking about the relative capability. North Korea's capabilities, Kim is messaging, are going to evolve unless at a minimum we come to terms with Kim, and then maybe we can avoid some of this continued growth in the program. That's part of the message that Kim is I think trying to send us. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that the sunk costs that Kim has already put in hunkering down his economy, in developing his military capabilities, and especially these ones that seem to be approaching the level of testing. These are things that he may not really be willing to change or to give up easily. That he's essentially got the sunk costs, and he's sending the strong message that this is the path that he's on. But some of these more theoretical things further out, they may be things where he's more flexible. And so this is sort of the broad direction that I'm seeing is continued development of capability, unless there is some fundamental change in direction from the U.S. And even if there is a change in direction, still this continued commitment to at least fielding the capabilities that he's already got, not giving up nuclear weapons. In other words, even if there may be some potential for North Korea to scale back testing or its aspirations for some of these specific programs. So as I wrap up here, let's go a little bit into Tech Locks territory and see if I can break down some of the specific events that we should expect, maybe the flow of events, and maybe a little bit of a narrative like Kent would use. So to begin, the focus a lot is on the idea of, is Kim going to try and get the Biden administration's attention? And my argument is North Korea has historically, and Kim Jong-un personally, has not really been that focused so much on just getting attention so much as he's focused on achieving his strategic goals. And sometimes he requires attention to get that, but it's not a matter of just, the goal is just to say, hey, I'm here and gather attention. We don't want to reduce Kim to a caricature like he's some kind of problem child just acting out. We have to think about this strategically of what's really driving his decisions. And so the body of analysis really, and historical examples really points to the idea that Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime in general approaches the idea of dealing with the adversaries, dealing with the United States and with South Korea in terms of pushing the envelope of what is possible and testing, not just testing weapon systems. We're talking about testing reactions, testing where the actual red lines are, and seeing basically how much the North Korea's goals can be advanced through stretching what is acceptable behavior while still minimizing the risk that it's going to result in an escalatory cycle that gets out of control. And so when you look particularly at the way that the regime weighs risk, I think there's an overemphasis on the thinking that we see from a lot of people on the risk of North Korea's economic situation to Kim Jong-un. North Korea is clearly not in a good place economically, and it hasn't been, in some ways for a long time, but it's particularly severe because of the COVID lockdown, because of the effects of sanctions. But what is the real risk to Kim Jong-un from this economic pressure, from the challenges that are inside North Korea? Until it gets to the point where it's actually going to affect his ability to achieve his goals and his ability to maintain power, this is something that is of interest to Kim, but it's not something that's going to dictate his behavior. And so my assessment from looking from the outside is Kim's not desperate yet, right? And if he's not facing a truly desperate situation, it's far more likely, again, based on looking at the big picture and the patterns of behavior, that Kim is going to try and achieve a position of strength vis-a-vis Washington. He doesn't want to risk appearing to be a supplicant to being in a weak position. So even if he is in a suboptimal position, he's still going to try and push and establish again, a stronger position through being able to, in this case, show that his weapon systems are continuing to advance. And in particular, he has to be able to show, I think, in his mind, that sanctions are not going to shake his resolve. And even though they're inflicting pain, they're not going to prevent his weapons advancement. So I think in the biggest picture, being able to credibly advance the threat to the United States is going to be a key part of his strategy going forward. But when you look at how he gets there, I think there's some pretty significant risks about just jumping to an ICBM test. Although Kim might do that as a tactic, but it's far more likely his overall strategy is going to be incrementally increase the pressure, incrementally test the boundaries, and essentially to keep probing. And so this is where the shorter range missiles and the solid field missiles come in. He can test weapons like he did in 2019 and 2020 and say, hey, now that we have a new US president, am I going to get a different reaction? And then also he can test missiles that are short of ICBM range that demonstrate different aspects of capability. And one of the things that really concerns me is the new Pukgoksong 5 missile that was displayed at a parade in January that looks like it has the capability to hold multiple reentry vehicles, but it's not an intercontinental range missile like the one behind me. So if he were to test a missile like this one, maybe not this specific model, but something similar of this Pukgoksong 5 that I mentioned, then he could demonstrate the capability to loft a payload that would have multiple reentry vehicles that would be positioned to pose a more credible threat, but he can do it without crossing the threshold of an ICBM. And this missile is larger than other solid fuel missiles that North Korea has tested and displayed before. So it also could be a stepping stone to having that solid fuel ICBM capability. And so incrementally, Kim Jong-un could keep advancing the capability, and then based on the reactions that he sees from China, he sees from the United States, then he can make the decision whether or not he's going to launch the ICBM. And I think when it informs strategy, one of the most important strategic ideas I'm trying to get across is that if North Korea tests an ICBM that has multiple reentry vehicles, this significantly advances Kim Jong-un's strategic position in his mind. It advances the threat to the United States, and it creates dilemmas for us in terms of, okay, how are we going to counter this with missile defense in a way that's not going to be destabilizing with Russia and with China? It creates dilemmas for us in terms of these complex interactions that come out of a more net assessment way of thinking about it. So as you try and predict these particular actions from North Korea, I would say the probability of something short of an ICBM test, in the next few months is very real. It's very high possibility, not guaranteed. I mean, there's a lot of things that could take him off of that path. But as you look over the longer term, the potential for an ICBM test, I think, is only going to grow until it eventually gets to the point where Kim decides that it's an acceptable risk. And in the end, I think that's got to be part of, to inform the strategy is how do we prevent Kim Jong-un from demonstrating a greater capability of threat in the United States? How do we prevent him from advancing the capabilities of tactical nuclear weapons, of multiple reentry vehicles, and then also, getting to the point of solid fuel ICBMs capable of striking the United States? I think that's the key strategic thing that, at least for now, we need to be focused on. And happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. I think denuclearization and an end to North Korea's missile program strategically absolutely still needs to be a goal. But I think a hard-headed strategic analysis is, in the near term, the goal really should be, for now, to prevent the growth of these capabilities and the testing and advancement of these systems, because of what it would mean for that net assessment of where North Korea stands vis-a-vis the United States and the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So that's my overall take on the methodology, looking at a hard target, and my strategic assessment forecast of where things are headed in the months and potentially years ahead. So obviously, there's a lot of things I had to skip over just to keep this to a reasonable length of time. So I'm happy to answer your questions and to talk about the implications more of some of the things that I laid out. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Marcus. That was terrific. So folks on the Zoom, please raise your hand. Zoom has changed this a little bit on us in the last few months. So you need to go to the reactions icon button there and raise your hand. And then also anyone on YouTube, feel free to throw a question into the chat. So to kick things off, I'm going to go to my colleague, Vipin Narang. Vipin, over to you.
Thanks, Taylor. Thanks, Marcus, so much for this talk. It was really interesting, and I think over the last several months, it's been great to get your thoughts and see how much we agree on in terms of what North Korea is doing, where it's going. I guess I have two sort of broader questions, but I think it will hopefully kick things off for everyone else too, which is, and you can pick and choose what you want to answer, but what are sort of the lessons about how North Korea got out of the barn in the first place, right? So there was a lot of derision and skepticism that a country that Nixon once referred to as a fourth-rate pipsqueak power or whatever could get nuclear weapons. So as we look at potential other proliferators like Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or whoever might follow, what are some of the lessons from your perspective, from the intelligence perspective, about how did North Korea manage to be so successful and sort of ahead of where our assessment and curve always was, right? I think we were always sort of underestimated where North Korea was in terms of its capabilities. And, is it a mix of assistance from the from former Soviet training? Is it Chinese protection? Is it good engineers at home? What are some of the sort of things, the lessons we have about how North Korea got to where it is today? And sort of the second question then is related. Where do we go from here? This is where the politics meets the reality that, we are loath to quote unquote accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons power, but it is. So how do we deal with it now, right? We don't want to admit it because it might incentivize other states, to pursue nuclear weapons. But at the same time, this is a monster of a program. It's only going to get worse. So, we have to start thinking about something else, which is how do we manage a horse that got out of the barn? And, the first question is how it got out. The second is now that it's out, what do we do? So what are some of the options? And will we look back at Hanoi, in your opinion, with regret for in passing on, at least potentially shuttering Yongbyon, if that was, truly on the table in terms of plutonium, tritium, non-trivial proportion of uranium production? And do you think North Korea is interested in sort of, slowing down the growth of its program, maybe freezing certain capabilities? And does the relationship, sort of improve now that North Korea has the confidence that it has, an ICBM, a nuclear ICBM capability against the United States? So there's a lot there. Feel free to answer whatever you want or don't want, but just sort of to set the stage for everyone else. And thanks again for a great talk.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Yeah, I mean, wow, what a lot to unpack there. I mean, I do want to try and hit on it all because I thought it was all really, really fascinating points. So I'll start with the part where you initiated, like, what's the lesson learned here? And I think the big lesson learned is don't underestimate a determined state that is trying to accomplish anything. And there's this tendency for capabilities analysis to lag. And it's not just for WMD, it's not just North Korea, although I think North Korea is a particularly egregious case. I think there's this tendency to believe that intentions are the hardest thing to figure out. Maybe tactically they are, but strategically, intentions are usually pretty clear, right? It's just that people miss the capabilities development because of inherent biases, or because, again, they're lagging until a capability is demonstrated that you don't think that they're going to have it. The number of times I've heard, well, North Korea has never shown the capability to do that, and then they show the capability to do whatever it is, right? And then they've shown it for the first time, right? And so North Korea had never shown the capability to secretly torpedo a South Korean vessel until they did it, right? I mean, so that's how they showed it. In the same way, North Korea had not, not shown the capability to be able to launch a mobile ICBM until they did it, right? I mean, so you can talk about, indications and different points of evidence, but in the end, until a capability is demonstrated, there's going to be this tendency to sort of say, well, they haven't done it yet, right? And then once they've done it, they say, oh, they've done it, and then there's a tendency to downplay, oh, it may not be reliable, they haven't tested it enough, whatever. And so I would say in general, the issue is one of trying to get ahead of emerging threats in a strategic sense, and not allow technical analysis to drag you into looking into the current or into the past, and think strategically about, if this particular country is committed, if it has the intention to develop this capability, how do we get out ahead of it, right? And not say, hey, we don't need to like take it that seriously yet because they're not there yet. And I think particularly in the case of North Korea, it was this sense that I think prevailed in a lot of people's minds that, and even does to this day, that North Korea is essentially reliant on outside help. It can't do it without, it can't do these things without help from outside of North Korea. North Korea made tremendous investments of economic and political capital in developing its weapons program and the intellectual underpinnings of it, the scientific underpinnings of it, so that they could minimize their reliance on the outside world. Did they need help from the Soviet Union and to some extent from China and from even from Western countries to get to where they are now? Sure. Are they still taking advantage of technology transfer and obtaining things illicitly and these sorts of things? Sure, they are. But in the end, North Korea has progressed to the point where so much of what it does, it's able to do with an internal knowledge and resources, because again, this was something that took place over a glacial period of time, because there was an underestimation, I think, of what a determined country can do to develop capabilities if it has the clear intentions. And so I think in the same way, we need to think about other countries and really gauge if they have the intention to develop this sort of capability. How can they be deterred from, and how can we change that intention, as opposed to pretending that we can bring a halt to the capability, right? Because that's proven to be extremely difficult. You can slow it down, and I think the mistake that was made early on, in my view, was the focus was on trying to, through sanctions, put too much on, and to be fair, this is something the US couldn't control because of the UN Security Council dynamics, but too much of the focus was on preventing North Korea from getting the components for WMD programs, as opposed to changing North Korea's mind, right? And so so the window, I think, has passed for changing North Korea's mind, passed long since. Maybe there was a really good opportunity to use pressure and sanctions to change intentions. So the key thing is, to me, focus on the intentions and changing those intentions rather than trying to go after the capabilities, because in the end, all you're going to do is buy yourself time. I think that's the most important lesson from my view, is just don't underestimate determined intentions, how capabilities can be developed despite despite all the international community's efforts to stop it. So on some of the other points that you've made, I mean, I do think that there are elements of North Korea's program that Kim Jong-un might be willing to trade away, especially, like I said, the things that are sort of more on the drawing board. But in the end, I'm really skeptical of sort of what some are terming an arms control approach, that we're going to be able to get Kim to really roll back big elements of this program for a price, and frankly that the U.S. or the world in general could really accept or pay. My take on Hanoi is actually quite different, and obviously I can't go into all the details, but I think there was a real effort made to try and get Kim to come off of his demand. And I think the narrative of essentially the president holding a hard line and, oh, sometimes you have to walk, I think that's overshadowed the fact that Kim basically completely miscalculated. He went into Hanoi thinking he could dictate terms in the United States, that he had a deal, and he couldn't get that deal. He didn't adapt. He didn't change direction. I think the record on that is fairly clear, even if you got to dig for a little bit. There's some good statements from a senior State Department official who was interviewed immediately afterwards on the record. But in the end, the news, because of the spin the president himself put on it, the news portrayed it sort of as the U.S. missing an opportunity and the U.S. being obstinate. But I think in point of fact, it was Kim Jong-un who missed the opportunity and who misplayed his hand and who miscalculated. And so I do think that there's an approach that can be taken to be more realistic about the capability that North Korea has without politically accepting it, right? I think there is a way. It's sort of like saying, I mean, we're kind of at the stage where we're almost in denial, right? And so what I have to say is, instead of denying that North Korea has these capabilities, we need to focus on denying them the strategic value they get out of those capabilities, and denying them their ability to hold us at risk with them, and deny them the ability to advance those capabilities further, rather than denying the capabilities' existence. So I think it is quite possible and necessary to intellectually acknowledge and deal with North Korea as they are nuclear armed, and that is not going to change for a while, without saying they are nuclear armed and that's okay and we're going to accept that indefinitely. I think there's a big difference between the two, and it's a very tough line to walk, right? But I find that we have a tendency in the conversations to gravitate to one of the two extremes. So I'm very much of the mind of accept the reality, but don't accept politically that this is an okay thing, especially given the history of the UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, the fact that the Chinese signed on the idea that North Korea, under the consensus of the international community, should not have nuclear weapons. And just because Russia and China aren't willing to be really pushing on the issue as we have been, and our allies have been in a more general sense, doesn't mean that there isn't an international consensus that it would be better for the world if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, and that is going against the will of the international community as expressed by the UN Security Council. And so I think within that space, though, there's some room for maneuver to negotiate limitations on testing, but also some room for maneuver to, in terms of conventional capability, build up deterrence by denial, instead of relying on just nuclear retaliation as the primary basis for keeping North Korea from getting the strategic leverage out of those weapons. So I know I didn't cover all the aspects of your question, but I feel like we should probably allow some other folks to weigh in.
Great, thanks. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pair questions, which means each person is limited to only one question with no subparts. So no sneaking in a three questions as one question. So this first pair will be Heather Williams and Jim Walsh. Heather, over to you.
Great, thanks. This is really fascinating. If it's okay, I would actually like to go back to the methodology discussion about strategic analysis, and was wondering if you could say a bit more about where budgetary constraints fit into that equation, and if at all they fit in, or do you do this analysis under the assumption that defense investments will remain constant for that entire long-term picture, or are you assuming some like changes in defense investment in any way? So thanks again.
Great, Jim.
Marcus, I thought it was a great talk, and I thought it embodied, the way you talked about Kent having a narrative and communicating with people. So I thought it was beautifully constructed. Since I only get one question, I want to be a responsible citizen. I guess my question is, you make a persuasive case that the goal here is to reach this tipping point where they can threaten the US homeland. And so my question is, if that's their intermediate goal, is that based on a notion of offense or defense? Do they expect to then hold on to that and extort it for value indefinitely? Or is it because they fear the US? Now, if it's the latter, that would seem to make the idea of accepting limitations more likely. But if it's the former, why would they accept limitations unless latency was enough? That's my question.
Great, thanks, Jim. Markus, back to you.
No, I think those are two great questions, and the beauty of it is I can probably answer them in an interconnected way. So the first question is just brilliant of the economic factor. Like I said, you got to consider it interdisciplinary. And I think in terms of the U.S. defense budgets and the resources that the U.S. has available, I think that's one of the reasons why the progression of the North Korean threat is such an issue, is that the U.S. does have limited resources. We have national security priorities to deal with other than North Korea. And so given the limitations of defense budgets and limitations of what we can afford to spend on different technologies and different force posture resources, that it is going to be challenging if North Korea is able to build capabilities unconstrained to be able to maintain a posture to stay ahead of North Korea. So I think U.S. budget limitations are key, South Korean budget limitations, but also we got to consider the resource limitations of North Korea. And I think that's that's another element at play. And that's one of the reasons why I am optimistic to go then to Jim's question about Kim's potential willingness to trade away for economic benefit certain elements of capability. And so I think the idea of posing a credible threat to the U.S. homeland, I don't think that's something that Kim will give up lightly. I don't think that honestly the price sort of can be paid, right? To get to that point. But I think other aspects of capability, I think, for example, the virtual boondoggle that having a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine would represent, I think Kim could be convinced that that's just not worth the cost, and that he can get some other benefits from basically trading that away. I'm not sure how much it's worth to us to not have Kim pursue that boondoggle and waste those resources in producing basically a underwater target for U.S. anti-submarine capability and packing a bunch of mobile missiles into one convenient location as opposed to spreading them out over mobile launchers for North Korea. But in the end, I think posing a credible threat to the homeland is something that the North Korean regime wants to do, not just because it fears the U.S. in general, but I think because of a specific scenario where North Korea fears the potential for an internal problem. This is what Kim fears, that then could lead to outside interference. The sort of the inverse of the Libya model, right? The North Korean Libya model they're concerned about is that there's some kind of challenge to the regime, and then outside military forces, particularly with the United States in the lead, end up in some way directly or indirectly supporting this opposition to the regime. And so ICBMs are the ultimate way to deter that. But they're a lot more than just that, right? They're a source of leverage. They're a source of of basically trying to get yourself in a position where you're seen as being on the same plane as the United States. I mean, there are so many different reasons why ICBMs have value to North Korea. We as Americans oftentimes focus on the cost, the liabilities, you know, and all the risks that Kim took on to get to that point. Okay, fair. But the point is, those are sunk costs now, largely, right? He's come this far. He's paid this much cost to have this capability. And I question whether or not that there's anyone who can pay enough of a price to Kim Jong-un to convince him, hey, you know, you can really afford to give these things up, and what you will get in exchange will be better. I think especially because, again, you know, Kim, you know, does not have an optimistic view of the potential for outside, you know, interference in if there is a challenge to his regime. But again, I don't think it's purely defensive. I think it gives him leverage, try and break the ROK-US alliance. I think it gives him, you know, a lot of strategic advantages that are more than just. I think survival is sort of the bottom line reason why he won't give them up. But I think the reason why he wants them far extends beyond just mere survival. And I think too much of the discussion, honestly, focuses on one or the other. Does he want these just for survival deterrence purposes, or does he want them to leverage for things like reunification of the Korean Peninsula? And the answer is, I think both, right? But in the end, the survival part is the reason why he's not going to give them up. The other elements are things where it may be, you know, fungible, but it also may be possible to deter him from pursuing anything beyond just survival, whether or not he has those capabilities. And I think that's the key, is how do you deny North Korea then the advantages that come with those capabilities, and how do you mitigate the risk?
Great, thanks. Well, we have time for one more pair of questions. And then for those of you who I'm not able to call on, please save your questions for the breakout room, so we'll still be able to get them into the discussion. And I'm going to go for the two Erics, Eric with a K and then Eric with a C. So Eric Lynn Greenberg, over to you, and then Higginbotham, over to you afterwards.
Thanks so much for a really interesting talk. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to the effect that the proliferation of kind of emerging commercial information gathering technologies has had on strategic intelligence analysis, and perhaps more broadly on kind of how the principals and senior decision makers are acting, right? And I'm thinking here about commercial imagery essentially running opposed to statements that Trump was making about North Korea following the summits. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Eric. Eric Higginbotham.
Great talk, Marcus. Thank you very much. You already spoke about ICBMs. I'll go to the other end of the nuclear scale and ask you what your assessment is. What's the significance of the statement on tactical nuclear weapons? Does it change how we think about North Korean intentions with regard to their development programs? And are there other developments in other areas, especially on the conventional side, which tell us either what the intentions are or are not with regard to tactical nuclear weapons? Thanks.
Great questions. These unfortunately are a little bit more distinct, so I can't weave an answer together like the last one. So on the first piece, this whole idea of the open source, you know, commercially available information, you know, I think it's really important to informing the thinking of the larger community of strategic decision makers, and I think it makes intelligence, I think, focus on, or it should make intelligence focus on what's the unique value added of either the specific sources of information that the IC has access to that the outside, you know, commercial and open source sector doesn't, or also to focus more focus more on the unique value-added proposition that the IC has in terms of methodology, in terms of having close contact with the decision makers, being inside the government, and should be having a reputation for being unbiased, although I think that comes into question a lot with the intelligence community, unfortunately. So I think some very senior leaders have argued to focus on the unique aspects of collection that the IC can bring, and I think others have argued for the unique sort of opportunity to inform decision making in a relevant yet unbiased sort of way that it's hard to do when you're outside of the government seen as advocating for a particular thing, or maybe not particularly connected to the policy process. So I think the challenge is more kind of how do you bridge the gap, and that was one of the things that I did a lot of in the National Intelligence Council, was actually outreach to outside expertise Some of it data driven, I think what you're alluding to, but a lot of it also just in terms of depth of experience and knowledge of individuals who reside outside the IC that can provide some different perspectives, some value added, and help counter biases within inside. So I think it's important, but and I think it's always an ongoing competition between the outside sources of information and the IC. I was very conscious of the fact that every time I was providing an IC assessment, it was probably not on a blank canvas, that the person that I was talking to at a senior level had already probably heard about this particular issue or aspects of it from the outside, from the news media, from the non-government analytics sector. And I think to speak to your point about these various sources then contradicting the line from what's inside the government, I think it does necessarily mean, and this could be like a whole other talk, but I think it means the government is probably going to have to be more transparent about a wide range of things to maintain its credibility. And I think the IC needs to be more comfortable with being transparent. I think the whole US government needs to be more comfortable with transparency and recognize that that basically you can't just hide behind and say, oh, it's classified, you can't know that, because a lot of times you can find out the very same thing through non-classified means. So on to the second question, I mean, I think it's really hard to say tactically with certainty exactly what sort of weapon systems that Kim has in mind, or the development program for these or whatever. But I think it fits with what the line that Kim had already been on was, the idea of developing the capability, not just to strike the United States, but to be able to take even a war on the Korean Peninsula or in the region to be nuclear. And I think specifically mentioning tactical nuclear weapons put a finer point on it, and perhaps emphasized the capability to develop, smaller warheads is what I think the point of what he was trying to make. But I think it fits very much with these, the tests of these shorter range, solid fuel, more advanced systems, which are useful conventionally because they've got greater precision, greater survivability, greater utility in a warfighting scenario. But also, as has been talked about by many outside experts, these things have large enough payloads that you could put plausible North Korean warheads on them, particularly if Kim is going down the road of smaller, more tactical systems. And so what it means, bottom line strategically, is that we cannot really think about a war with North Korea, or we shouldn't think about a war with North Korea, without thinking about the potential that that war goes nuclear. The idea that you can contain it to a conventional conflict really goes out the window the more you think about the breadth of the capabilities that North Korea has. And especially if you're talking about threatening the survival of the regime in this conflict, the risk that North Korea would use nuclear weapons is very high. There's been some great writing on this now for years, but now that Kim is more demonstrating that this isn't just theoretical, this is a capability that he's going to continue to develop and grow. I think it has huge implications for how the United States approaches deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. And it really, to me, emphasizes the need for deterrence by denial, and basically early in a crisis, keeping the North Koreans from thinking that they can achieve some limited goal, so that we never get to the point where it explodes into a full-scale conflict, which then raises the risks of nuclear war to a very high level, right? And North Korea honestly benefits from that, right? As they know that we don't want a nuclear war, right? And so presenting the potential that of use of tactical nuclear weapons escalating to that level, I think provides advantage to North Korea in terms of leverage and in terms of its own deterrence, right, of trying to deter if it does something provocative. So I think it requires us to then focus on not just the high-end issues of how do we convince North Korea not to do its nuclear weapons, but it's how do we convince North Korea not to be in the mode where it does things that lead to a level of escalation where it could even credibly say this may go nuclear, so go no further, right? How do we even get to that point? I think that's a big problem.
Great, thanks, Marcus, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in on YouTube. We're going to end the live stream here now, and then go into some breakout rooms on Zoom.